46 years ago today,
We are holding our own.
sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died.
Beneath the cold, dark waters of Lake Superior lies a ship that has kept its secrets for 50 years. The Edmund Fitzgerald isn't just a wreck, it's a story of hidden failures and quiet disaster.
As this footage looked at the wreck, it was really hard to see anything in it.
Over decades, theories ranged from rogue waves to navigation failures, but the truth remained hidden until now. Advanced underwater drones have finally reached the wreck, capturing Ultra HD footage and 3D scans that reveal chilling new details.
Look at that, it's just totally
Completely shredded.
mangled, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like no man's land. I didn't realize just how severe the damage was in between the two sections.
Missing hatch clamps, torn vents, and early signs of flooding. What these discoveries show is haunting. Pride of the American side. When she first hit the water in 1958, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was seen as a giant you couldn't ignore. More than 700 feet long, she was the biggest freighter on the Great Lakes and one of the most admired. Built by Great Lakes Engineering Works in Michigan and owned by Northwestern Mutual, the Fitzgerald became known for her power, speed, and sharp look. Her bright white upper decks and deep red hull became a familiar sight across the region. For 17 years, she carried taconite iron ore from Minnesota to different ports, making trip after trip without trouble. Her crew took pride in the ship, calling her the pride of the American side, and people loved watching her glide under the Mackinac Bridge or pull smoothly into harbor. On her final run, she was under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, a respected and experienced sailor. On 9th November 1975, the Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin, carrying over 26,000 tons of iron pellets and heading toward Detroit. Close behind her was another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. The weather that day was tense, but the forecast didn't show how quickly the storm over Lake Superior was growing. Within hours, winds hit more than 70 miles per hour, and waves rose higher than 25 feet. Even through the chaos, McSorley kept pushing toward shelter. On 10th November, just after 7 p.m., the Fitzgerald disappeared from radar. Minutes before, McSorley had radioed Anderson with his last message: "We are holding our own."
He said he had his pumps on. I asked him if he had his pumps on. He said yes. And then Morgan, as an afterthought, I said, "How you doing?" He said, "We're holding our own." That was at 7:10. That was the last transmission we had from him.
After that, everything went silent. No distress call, no flares, nothing. When rescue teams searched the area, they found only pieces of debris. The ship itself was later discovered split in two, resting more than 500 feet down. No bodies were ever recovered, and the loss shook the entire nation. Investigations began almost immediately. The United States Coast Guard suggested that water may have entered through damaged or loose cargo hatch covers. The researchers leaned toward a structural failure, believing the ship may have broken apart on the surface. Families of the crew firmly rejected the hatch cover theory, worried it placed blame on the men who had worked the ship for years. With no agreement on the cause, the mystery only deepened. In the following decades, technology improved. Early dives in the 80s and 90s showed grainy video and simple sonar maps of the two halves of the wreck, but the details were too limited to settle anything. By the year 2020, a new wave of experts stepped in. Marine archaeologists, engineers, and AI-assisted researchers. Backed by NOAA and a Great Lakes history group, they returned to the wreck with advanced underwater drones, Ultra HD cameras, powerful sonar, and AI tools that could build 3D models in real time. Their mission was simple: understand the damage in detail and look for clues no one had ever seen clearly before. Drone meets the Fitzgerald.
Return to the Fitzgerald since Rick's visit in 2004. He hopes on the 50th anniversary, which is in 2025, he can travel back down to the wreck site and explore it again.
Before sunrise, the crew lowered the ROV into the cold, black water. The surface looked calm, but it meant nothing. This was the same lake that had swallowed a 729-foot ship without warning. As the drone sank, its bright lights carved thin beams through the murky depths, revealing nothing but drifting silt at first. The pressure increased, the temperature dropped, and the darkness thickened. Still, the ROV was built for moments like this. It carried strong floodlights, detailed sonar, 4K cameras, and smooth thrusters that allowed it to move gently around fragile structures. Inside the control room, engineers watched the screens closely. For a long moment, all they saw were tiny organisms floating in the water. Then a shadow appeared, huge and unmistakable. Someone whispered, "There she is." the drone's lights revealed the bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald, still standing upright, partly buried in the sediment. Even after decades underwater, it looked strangely calm. The stern, twisted and upside down, lay nearby. Nothing about the scene appeared chaotic, and somehow that made it even more unsettling. The ROV moved along the hull at a slow, steady pace. Small fish flickered past the camera. When the drone's arm brushed away a layer of silt, the faded name Fitzgerald appeared on the steel. On the ship above, the crew stayed silent. Many of them had studied the wreck for years, but seeing it with their own eyes felt different. It no longer seemed like a legend. It was a real place where real men had vanished. Then the drone reached the cargo hatches. On the monitor, a researcher frowned and said, "Back it up 3 feet." The operator reversed the drone slightly. What came into view changed the mood instantly. It was the kind of discovery that could shift the entire understanding of the ship's final moments. As the ROV glided slowly over Edmund Fitzgerald's bow, the silence in the control room grew heavier. The drone's lights illuminated the forward deck, revealing steel that had not seen daylight in nearly 50 years. Covered in silt and rust, it bore the quiet dignity of a ship that had died serving its purpose. But then the camera panned across the cargo hatches, massive rectangular steel doors that had once sealed in tens of thousands of tons of iron ore, and one of the engineers leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "There," he said, pointing to the monitor. "That clamp's not just corroded, it's gone." The team began calling out measurements and camera angles as the ROV adjusted its position, hovering directly over the forwardmost hatch cover. It was immediately obvious to anyone with experience in ship design or lake freighters. Multiple heavy-duty steel clamps meant to hold the hatch tightly closed were either entirely missing or warped beyond recognition. Some appeared to have been ripped away. Others were bent backwards like broken fingers. Each of the Fitzgerald's 21 hatch covers had been secured with 22 clamps. That's over 450 steel clamps designed to keep those doors sealed against even the most violent conditions. Their role was critical. Without them, heavy waves crashing across the deck could force water through even a tiny seam. In the pounding chaos of a storm like the one that swallowed the Fitzgerald, a failed clamp could mean disaster. But what stunned the team wasn't just the absence of these clamps. It was the location of the failure. This was the forwardmost hatch situated closest to the bow, the part of the ship most exposed to the storm's fury, and right next to it was another troubling sight. Signs of a hidden disaster. The first thing the team noticed was the shattered air vent pipe, one of the long steel tubes that once carried fresh air into the cargo hold. Now it was simply gone. The base where it had once stood was ripped open, leaving a rough, jagged hole in the deck. This wasn't normal rust. Something had torn the pipe away with huge force, most likely a mix of weakening metal and repeated hits from towering waves more than 25 feet high. The meaning was hard to ignore. One of the engineers finally spoke. "That right there, that's how she sank." Right away, the team pulled up the old Coast Guard audio. At 3 p.m. on November 10th, Captain McSorley had reported 3 key problems. The ship had a bad list. It had lost a vent, and one of the hatches was leaking a little, but he believed it was under control. But as the ROV kept moving, it became clear that nothing had been under control at all. The missing clamps, the torn-off vent, and the warped steel around the hatch made a different story. The Fitzgerald had been taking on water, probably for hours, before it ever disappeared from radar. Back in 1977, the Coast Guard concluded water likely entered through damaged or ineffective hatch covers, eventually flooding the front cargo holds. Families of the crew pushed back, worried it implied a mistake by the men on board. Other theories grew over time. Maybe the ship hit a shoal, or maybe it snapped in half on the surface before anyone could call for help. But this new footage, clearer and more complete than anything gathered before, pointed in one direction. As the drone scanned the second and third hatches, the same worrying pattern kept showing up. Clamps are missing or bent out of shape. Deep marks showing stress from heavy waves. Trails of sediment around the hatch edges, hinting at water forcing its way through. Even signs that some clamps had been replaced long before the storm, suggesting years of wear that may not have been fully appreciated. If even a handful of those clamps failed, water could have rushed in fast, and on a ship carrying more than 26,000 tons of ore, even a slight tilt could turn into a deadly roll within minutes. By the time the ROV finished its work, the mood on the research vessel had changed. There was no excitement. Progressive flooding exposed. The footage from the new underwater drone didn't just support an old idea, it shook people who know ships inside out. To anyone who isn't familiar with lake freighters, a broken vent pipe or a few missing hatch clamps might sound like small issues. But to marine engineers, naval historians, and people who spend their lives on the water, these details are warnings so serious they can't be ignored. A ship as big as the Edmund Fitzgerald depends on one thing above all: staying watertight. If that is lost, nothing else matters. One naval architect from the University of Michigan watched the new footage and said quietly, "That ship was flooding at deck level. There was no way back from that." His voice said everything the images didn't. The Fitzgerald was considered strong. Each hatch had 22 clamps, and if even one bent or loosened, the steel cover could flex. A tiny opening was all it took for water to push through. There was no backup seal, no second barrier, only the clamps. And then came the vent pipe. The most troubling part for many experts. The drone showed clear signs that one of the cargo hold vents had been torn away at its base. This was likely the same vent Captain McSorley mentioned in his final radio call when he reported a bad list and a vent gone. Vents are supposed to move air, not water. But once ripped off, a vent becomes a direct hole into the cargo hold. Simulations later done by the research team painted a frightening picture. With a sheared vent and weakened clamps, water could have surged in at almost 4,000 gallons per minute during the storm. At that speed, the front of the ship would fill faster than the pumps could ever handle. Within half an hour, the bow would start dipping, and once the bow dipped, the weight of the water would drag it even deeper, triggering a rapid chain of events that no crew on Earth could stop. This matches the last radar sweep from the Arthur M. Anderson. One moment, the Fitzgerald was holding steady in the storm. Next, it vanished completely. It leads to the darkest part of the story. What the crew did was shocking. Silence in the storm. The silence on the radio has always been one of the strangest parts of the Edmund Fitzgerald story. No mayday, no flare, no final call. Nothing. A ship that size doesn't just vanish without warning, unless the danger built up slowly, hidden from everyone on board. And now, with the new underwater footage, that idea finally makes sense. If water began pouring in through a broken vent pipe or a failed hatch clamp, the crew may not have noticed right away. Fitzgerald could have been pushing forward through the storm, thinking she was holding steady, while her bow was quietly sinking lower and lower. By the time the list became obvious, the situation might have already been beyond saving. A freighter loaded with iron ore becomes incredibly heavy at the front once water gets inside, and when that weight shifts fast, the ship can plunge under in seconds. Many experts believe that's exactly what happened. The bow went down hard, the stern tried to stay up, and the ship snapped. A historian on the dive team put it plainly: there was no sabotage, no explosion, no mysterious force. Everything seemed normal until it suddenly wasn't. And that's what makes this discovery so unsettling. It shows how a tiny failure in a massive ship can turn into a disaster almost no one sees coming. What shocked the researchers even more was how preventable this kind of failure would be today. Modern freighters have stronger hatch systems, backup seals, better vents, and sensors that detect flooding instantly. The Fitzgerald, for all her fame, sailed without any of these protections. She was a giant, yes, but a giant built in the 1950s with limits that became deadly in the wrong storm. The Coast Guard suggested hatch failure in its 1977 report, but almost everyone pushed back at the time. Families didn't want the crew blamed. Shipping companies didn't want design weaknesses exposed. For decades, people argued over theories, rogue waves, sudden breakups, and hidden shoals. But none of those ideas had solid proof. The drone footage changed everything. It showed missing clamps, bent metal, a torn vent pipe, and clear signs of water rushing inside. Engineers reviewing the video agreed. This was progressive flooding, not a sudden breakup. The bow was already sinking long before the ship disappeared from radar. Arthur Anderson's last calls. Edmund Fitzgerald was a giant on the Great Lakes, but even giants can make dangerous choices. Hurricane-force winds ripped across Lake Superior, gusting over 100 miles per hour, sending 25-foot waves slamming against her hull. Captain McSorley fought to keep the ship steady as the snow. Water crashed over the deck, both radars were out, and the freighter began to tilt. Over the radio, McSorley calmly reported, "I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I've ever been in." Arthur M. Anderson followed close behind, offering guidance and watching for danger. The crews shared weather updates, knowing the storm was growing. Yet Fitzgerald pressed on. She slowed slightly to manage the waves, but every choice seemed to push her deeper into the storm's heart. Why did she take that risk? McSorley chose a northern route meant to save time, a path thought to be safer and more sheltered. On paper, it was a smart move, a common practice among Great Lakes captains during storms. But Lake Superior doesn't care for plans. The storm grew fiercer than anyone could imagine, waves battering the Fitzgerald's side, gusts throwing her off balance, and the mighty ship fought to stay upright. At 7 p.m., Anderson's mate called again, checking in. McSorley's reply was steady. "We are holding our own." There was no panic, no hint of how dire things had become. "Okay, fine. I'll be talking to you later," came the response. That would be the last conversation ever heard from Fitzgerald. Hours passed with no answer. The lake swallowed her silence. When rescuers finally arrived, there was only an oil slick, 2 empty lifeboats, and nearly 3 dozen life jackets drifting in 50-degree water. Fitzgerald was gone. What's haunting is not just the destruction, but the choices that led here. The ship had warnings, had guidance, and had another vessel close behind. She could have slowed, could have sought safer waters. Instead, she pressed forward, confident in her strength, ignoring the growing threat. The storm, relentless and merciless, punished every risk. Skyscraper on the water. On the lakes, waves rise like jagged mountains and strike almost without warning. Experts like Bacon have pointed out that crews might face 2 or even 3 waves over 50 feet tall, or a single swell topping 60 feet, hitting a ship already battered by hours of relentless wind and rain. One massive wave at the wrong moment might have been all it took. Some researchers suggest that Edmund Fitzgerald may have been caught straddling 2 waves at once, her bow lifted by one, her stern by another, leaving her heavy, cargo-laden midsection unsupported. The result: the middle third of the ship could have suddenly collapsed, almost like a box dropping through the floor. The bow plunged toward the lake bed, the stern rolled over, and the entire event happened in an instant. That could explain the silence on the radio. The absence of a distress call makes sense if the ship failed that quickly. Researchers point out, imagine a 73-story skyscraper on its side, only 75 feet wide. That's what these lake freighters are like. You don't see ships like this anywhere else. This unique design allowed the Fitzgerald to carry enormous cargoes through the narrow locks of the Great Lakes, but it also made her vulnerable. In rough seas, it's possible the bow rode one wave, while the stern rode another, leaving the midsection unsupported and under extreme stress. Could repeated pounding from the storm have caused unseen cracks to grow, weakening the ship long before she vanished from radar? So how do you explain a vessel so carefully built, crewed by experienced mariners, and navigating one of the most studied lakes in the world, ending up at the bottom in such a short time? Was it a sudden catastrophe, a series of miscalculations, or just nature pushing a fragile design too far? The truth may lie in the combination of forces no single theory can cover: rogue waves, flooding, and a hull stretched to its limits. Each factor alone might not have been enough, but together they created a deadly cocktail. And while the storm and the waves get most of the attention, the real problem may have started long before the storm ever hit. Hidden flaws beneath the steel. Edmund Fitzgerald looked like a giant built to last. From her polished steel decks to her deep red hull, she inspired confidence. But beneath that exterior, the ship carried a series of hidden problems most people never knew about. From the very start, her backbone, the keel running along the hull, wasn't perfect. Workers reinforced it with extra metal plates and welding rods even before the ship ever touched water. One former captain called it a loose keel. These flaws were noted in Coast Guard reports, but never widely shared. Even after construction, maintenance often only patched obvious issues. During winter layups, crews checked the hull, but fixes were minimal. George Bergner, a former crew member, recalled the 1972 winter layups when old keel weld breaks were spotted. Captain McSorley applied only quick patches, letting small cracks grow over time. Fitzgerald also had a record of minor accidents. She ran aground in 1969, collided with the SS Hochelaga in 1970, scraped lock walls multiple times in the early 70s, and lost her bow anchor in 1974. None of these incidents alone would sink a ship, but together they stressed the hull, leaving unseen marks that weakened the structure. Experts note that regulatory changes allowed her to carry more cargo, raising her load line and reducing reserve buoyancy. In heavy seas, she didn't ride over waves, she wallowed, putting even more strain on a hull already stretched to its limits. By the time she sailed on her final voyage, the Fitzgerald carried more than iron ore. She carried decades of hidden damage, minor accidents, and structural compromises. Alone, each problem might not have been deadly. Together, they created a ticking time bomb. We hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more amazing stories.